So let's talk about another guiding technique that some blind and visually impaired people are using, which is a guide dog. So just to tell you, so you have better understanding and idea on what the guide dog actually does. So the handler and the guide dog are a partnership. They are really in relation to each other, and they need each other to successfully navigate handlers' way around. So what the guide dog does is it walks centrally along the pavement while avoiding obstacles on the route. It doesn't turn corners unless told so to do so, stops at curbs and steps and waits for the instructions, finds doors, crossings, and places which are visited regularly. The dog also judges height and width, so handler doesn't bump his head or shoulder, for example, and that's called overhead awareness. So many guide dogs have actually the ability to recognize overhead obstructions for their owner. A guide dog has the ability to identify obstacles at head height, which a white cane, for example, would not be able to do and identify. So, for example, if there is a low-hanging tree branch, a guide dog will guide their handler around it, so the handler doesn't go straight into it. The white dog helps also to keep handler straight when crossing a road, but it is up to handler to decide where and when to cross safely. So it's not the dog who decides, it's always the handler. However, the guide dog is trained in something very unique, which is called intelligent disobedience. So a guide dog will always stop at a crosswalk or intersection. And then the owner must listen to the traffic and determine when it is safe to cross, because the dog simply can't see and can't recognize if the light is red or green. The owner will then instruct the dog to walk. But if the dog believes that the walking would put the owner in harm, it will purposely disobey the instruction, which is very important and for the guide dog to do. So that's very unique thing for any service dog, intelligent disobedience. So in order for the guide dog and the handler to be able to cooperate and function, and for the guide dog to provide the service that it's actually trained for the handler, there must be proper circumstances for it. And that's something that, for example, people who are responsible for the design, for the safety of the streets and what's going on in the cities and public services can actually ensure. So what you should think about in order to make it easier for the guide dog to help the handler to orient themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the dog is trained to stop at any curbs, edges, and so on. So in order for it to do that, there must be curbs and edges. So there is a tendency in some cities to, for example, start removing curbs and edges on the streets. This is not good for the guide dog, because then the guide dog can't recognize where the street starts or where the pedestrian pavement, for example, stops. So it is very important to keep curbs and edges. Another thing is that it is important to separate the spaces on the pavement, for example. So the pedestrians are separated from the cyclists, for example. So we avoid the situation when the cyclist just bumps into the handler and the guide dog and runs over the dog, for example. It's a safety measure. So whenever it's possible, try to separate those sections of the pavement and mark it properly with either some edge or a tactile surface so the dog can actually recognize it. When a handler walks with a guide dog, they also need a little bit more space, so the dog can easier orient itself and notice different obstacles. So it is also good to think and plan when it's possible wide paths. And also it's important to keep the streets clean and without clutter. No clutter, the easier for the dog to orient itself and navigate the handler. And the clean streets, it is as well a safety measure because, I mean, for example, if there is a lot of broken glass on the streets, the dog can get hurt and so on. And another thing which is very important to remember, and something that Vladia was talking about, it is important to make sure and ensure that the guide dog has access to public buildings, leisure, culture, and sports facilities. It should be marked that that the guide dog, whenever the pet dog is not allowed, the guide dog should be an exception, because that's in the legislation, and that's what you can actually do. There is another thing I would like to tell you about, which I think is as well very important, and I can imagine that Vladia will agree with me. There is a certain etiquette when it comes to guide dogs and service dogs. There are several guidelines people should follow when in the presence of a guide or service dog to allow the dog. It's for the safety of the dog and its handler. And disregarding these guidelines can distract the dog, which can potentially create a dangerous situation for the dog and its handler. So what you should remember, what anyone should remember, first of all, don't touch, talk, feed, or otherwise distract the dog while he's wearing his harness or vest. When the harness or vest is on, the dog is working, and it should be treated as such. You should allow the dog to concentrate and perform for the safety of his handler. So don't treat the dog as a pet, but give him the respect that the working dog deserves. However, it doesn't mean that you never allow to interact with the guide dogs. You should though always ask before you do so, and pet or interact with the dog in any way. Most handlers will allow it as if they think that it's appropriate situation and they have time for it. If you have small children who don't know better, try to keep them close and don't allow them to run to the dog and distract the dog. So make sure that they don't approach the service animal. Another thing is if you walk with your own pet dog, you should also not allow your dog to wander over for a meet and greet with the guide dog. It can be very distracting for the service dog. It was mentioned earlier in a video, but I think it's important to repeat. Always speak to the blind or visually impaired person directly and not to their sighted companion or the guide dog. Never grab the guide dog's leash, collar, or harness. The guide dog is trained to take commands from the handler and not other people. Do not try coax a guide dog forward or direct them in any way. This is the responsibility of the handler. It's the handler who directs the dog. And then the last thing, when you are in the situation that you actually walk with a guide dog team, you should always ask the handler where you should walk. It might be, depending on the situation, the handler might ask you to walk ahead or on one of their sides, or just slightly behind them by one of their shoulders.